In the shadowed halls of the ancient castle, where power flows like wine and silence is the currency of survival, I learned that invisibility is both blessing and curse. For 3 years, I moved through these stone corridors like a ghost, serving, cleaning, existing in the spaces between notice and neglect. I was Ravana the kitchen servant, Ravana the orphan, Ravana the nothing. I thought anonymity would protect me from the wolves that prowled these gilded halls. I thought if I kept my scent muted, my eyes downcast, my presence forgettable, I could carve out a small, safe life in the margins of greatness. I was wrong. They say that fate has a cruel sense of humor, that it delights in unraveling carefully laid plans with a single, careless moment. Mine unraveled with spilled wine and crystal shards scattered across marble floors, in the heartbeat between a king's rage and a wolf's recognition. King Kaelin saw me, truly saw me, for perhaps the first time in 3 years, and in that moment of fury, when his golden eyes blazed with an alpha's wrath, something ancient and irreversible awakened between us. His wolf claimed what his mind had spent years denying, marking me with teeth and dominance before the entire court. Now I am bound to the most dangerous man in the realm, tethered by bonds that pulse with his emotions, his hungers, his carefully controlled violence. The invisible servant has become the visible queen, thrust into a world where every smile hides a blade, and every courtesy conceals a threat. He marked me in anger, this king of shadows and steel. But as the bond deepens and his wolf calls to mine across the darkness of his tortured soul, I begin to understand a terrifying truth. What was meant as punishment has become his salvation, and mine may be learning to love the monster who claimed me. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning mist still clung to the castle walls when Ravana slipped through the servants' entrance, her worn boots silent against the stone floors. Dawn had barely broken, painting the corridors in shades of gray and amber, and she preferred it this way, when the castle felt empty, when she could move through its halls like a ghost, unnoticed and unbothered. She had learned long ago that invisibility was her greatest asset. 3 years had passed since she had arrived at the royal castle, orphaned and alone, clutching nothing but a letter of recommendation from her village's elder and the clothes on her back. 3 years of scrubbing floors, serving meals, and keeping her head down. 3 years of watching the world of alphas and betas from the shadows, knowing she would never belong to it. Omegas like her, weak, unmated, without family or fortune, were tolerated in the castle only as long as they remained useful and unseen. It was a precarious existence, but it was survival, and Ravana had become very good at surviving. The kitchen was already bustling when she arrived, despite the early hour. Head cook. Marta stood at the central island, her graying hair pulled back severely as she barked orders at the scullery maids. The woman had the temperament of a cornered badger, and the authority to make or break any servant's life with a single complaint to the head steward. "You're late," Marta snapped without looking up from the inventory list in her hands. "I'm sorry. It won't happen again." Ravana tied her apron strings and moved toward the stack of serving platters that needed polishing. She had actually arrived exactly on time, but arguing with Marta was pointless and potentially dangerous. See that it doesn't. Today is the Autumn Council, and everything must be perfect. The king has invited alphas from 3 neighboring territories, and if even one goblet is smudged or one course is delayed, it will be your hide. The mention of the king sent a familiar chill down Ravana's spine. In 3 years, she had seen King Kaelin perhaps a dozen times, always from a distance, always while she was serving or cleaning. But even from afar, his presence was overwhelming, a darkness that seemed to swallow light, a barely contained violence that made her wolf press flat against her consciousness in submission. Everyone knew the stories. How he had claimed his throne at 19 after his father's death, crushing 3 separate rebellion attempts before his 20th birthday. How he had single-handedly defeated the Northern Pack's champion in ritual combat, leaving the man permanently crippled. How he had ordered the execution of his own cousin for treason, watching without emotion as the sentence was carried out. King Kaelin ruled through fear, and fear kept the kingdom stable. It also kept Omegas like Ravana very, very careful. "Ravana!" Marta's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Stop daydreaming and help with the wine service. The good crystal, not the everyday glasses." Wine service. Ravana's stomach clenched. That meant entering the throne room during the formal ceremonies, being visible to the court, to the king himself. She had managed to avoid such duties for months by being quick with other tasks, by volunteering for kitchen work that kept her safely below stairs. Perhaps Sarah could, she began. Sarah is sick with fever, and I need someone with steady hands. Unless you're telling me you can't be trusted with the king's crystal? The threat was clear. Refuse, and face immediate dismissal. Be dismissed, and face starvation, or worse, on the streets. Of course I can be trusted, Ravana said quietly. What do you need me to do? Marta's smile was sharp as a blade. The ceremonial wine service during the opening feast. You'll carry the crystal goblets on the silver tray. Serve each guest according to rank, and absolutely under no circumstances will you speak unless spoken to. Can you manage that without embarrassing us all? Yes, ma'am. Good. The wine is already decanted. The special vintage from the royal cellars. Don't even breathe on it wrong. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Ravana helped arrange the serving platters, polished the ceremonial crystal until it gleamed like captured starlight, and tried to calm her increasingly nervous wolf. By the time the great bells chimed noon, signaling the beginning of the autumn council ceremonies, her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. The throne room had been transformed for the occasion. Tapestries bearing the royal coat of arms hung from every column, and fresh rushes scented with lavender and rosemary covered the floors. Long tables draped in midnight blue cloth formed a horseshoe shape before the dais, where the king's throne sat like a monument to power itself. Ravana entered through the servant's door, carrying the heavy silver tray with both hands. The crystal goblets caught the light from the great chandeliers, casting rainbow prisms that danced across the stone walls. Each piece was worth more than she would earn in a lifetime, and the weight of that responsibility made her movements careful and deliberate. The hall was already filled with guests, alphas in formal dress uniforms, betas wearing their family colors, a few high-ranking omegas in silk gowns that probably cost more than entire villages. The air was thick with the mingled sense of power, politics, and barely contained aggression as territorial leaders sized each other up. And at the center of it all, commanding attention even while sitting motionless, was the king. Ravenna had forgotten how overwhelming his presence could be. King Kalen wore ceremonial robes of deep silver trimmed with midnight blue, the colors of the royal house. His dark hair was longer than current fashion dictated, touching his shoulders and giving him a wild, dangerous look that somehow suited him perfectly. Even seated, she could see the power in his frame. Broad shoulders, strong hands that had wielded both sword and claw in battle. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. Golden brown like aged whiskey, they held an intelligence that seemed to strip away all pretense and see straight to the truth of things. Those eyes had condemned men to death and pardoned others on whims that no one else could predict. Right now, those eyes were focused on Alpha Marcus of the Western Territories, who was speaking in the formal, flowery language that politics demanded. Ravenna couldn't hear the words from her position near the servants' station, but she could see the tension in the king's posture, the way his fingers drummed once against his throne's armrest before stilling completely. "Begin the wine service," whispered Elena, the head-serving girl. "Start with the high table, then work your way down by rank. Remember, eyes down, movements smooth, no unnecessary words." Ravenna nodded and lifted her tray. The crystal sang softly as she moved, a pure, clear note that seemed to harmonize with her rapidly beating heart. She approached the high table where the most important guests sat, beginning with Alpha Marcus himself. The Western Territory leader was exactly what she had expected. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of presence that came from generations of noble breeding. He nodded slightly as she set the goblet before him, the acknowledgement that was more than most alphas would offer a servant. Next came Alpha Victoria of the Eastern Territories, a fierce woman with prematurely gray hair and scars on her hands that spoke of battles fought personally rather than delegated to others. She didn't even glance at Ravenna, but that was preferable to hostile attention. One by one, Ravenna served the honored guests, her movements becoming more confident as she fell into the rhythm of the task. Lift, pour, place, retreat. Simple actions that kept her mind occupied and her nervous energy focused. She was nearly finished with the high table when she reached the final guest, Alpha Thomas of the Northern Territories, a young man who had inherited his position just 2 years prior and was still proving himself worthy of it. He was deep in conversation with the beta beside him, gesturing emphatically as he made some point about trade agreements. Ravenna set the goblet down carefully and began to retreat when Alpha Thomas's elbow swung wide, catching the edge of the crystal. The goblet tipped, wine splashing across the table, and in his surprise, he jerked backward, bumping into Ravenna. The tray tilted. The remaining goblet slid. Time slowed to a crawl as Ravenna watched the crystal tumble through the air, each piece catching the light like falling stars. She lunged forward, desperate to catch them, but her foot caught in the rushes and she stumbled. The wine, the precious, irreplaceable ceremonial vintage, arced through the air in a perfect crimson cascade and landed directly on King Kaelin's ceremonial robes. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the musicians in the gallery stopped playing mid-note, as if the very air had turned to stone. Ravenna knelt on the floor surrounded by crystal shards, her empty tray beside her, wine dripping from her hair and dress. But none of that mattered. Nothing mattered except the spreading crimson stain across the king's silver robes and the expression of absolute deadly fury that was slowly overtaking his features. She had seen that look once before, 3 years ago, when a minor lord had been caught embezzling from the royal treasury. The man had been thrown from the castle walls the same day. She began, but her voice failed her completely. King Kaelin rose from his throne with the fluid grace of a predator, and the entire hall seemed to shrink around him. He was taller than she remembered, broader, and when his golden eyes fixed on her, she felt pinned like a butterfly to a board. "Your name," he said quietly. His voice carried easily through the silent hall, each word precise and controlled. "Ravenna, Your Majesty." The words came out as barely a whisper. "Ravenna." He repeated her name as if tasting it, testing its weight. "And you work in my kitchens." It wasn't a question. Somehow, impossibly, he knew who she was despite her efforts to remain invisible. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the wine soaking through her dress. "Yes, Your Majesty." He descended the steps of the dais slowly, and with each step, she felt the weight of his presence more acutely. The other guests had pulled back, creating a wide circle around them, but she could feel their stares like physical pressure. 3 years, he continued, still in that terrifyingly calm voice. 3 years you have worked in my castle, have you not? Yes, Your Majesty. 3 years of steady service. No complaints from the kitchen staff. No incidents or accidents. He was close enough now that she could see the wine drops scattered across the silver fabric, could smell his scent, pine and steel and something wild that made her wolf whimper. Until today, she wanted to explain about Alpha Thomas, about the accident that had started the chain of events, but she knew it wouldn't matter. The result was the same, regardless of the cause. She had embarrassed the king in front of his most important allies. "I'm sorry," she managed. "I'm so very sorry, Your Majesty. It was an accident, but that doesn't—" "An accident." The words cut through her apology like a blade. "Do you know what my ancestors did to servants who had accidents involving the royal person?" Her throat was so tight she could barely breathe. "No, Your Majesty. They were given to the dungeons. The lucky ones died quickly." His eyes had begun to glow with an inner light, his wolf rising to the surface. "The unlucky ones took weeks." A sob caught in her throat. She had known this was how it would end, had known from the moment the wine left the goblets, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly was worse than she had imagined. "However," he continued, and she looked up sharply, hope flaring despite herself, "I am not my ancestors. I am more creative in my punishments." The hope died immediately, replaced by a terror that was somehow worse than the prospect of simple execution. What could be worse than death? What creativity could the mind that had conceived some of the realm's most brutal military campaigns bring to bear on one insignificant Omega? "Stand up," he commanded. Her legs shook, but she managed to rise, crystal crunching under her feet. Wine continued to drip from her hair, and she could feel it staining the collar of her simple gray dress. Around them, the court watched in fascinated horror, as if witnessing some grand theatrical performance. "Look at me," he said. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her eyes down, to maintain the submissive posture that had kept her alive for 3 years. But his voice carried the weight of absolute command, and her head lifted against her will. The moment their gazes met, something strange happened. The king's expression flickered, just for a heartbeat, from cold fury to something else. Surprise? Recognition? Before she could identify it, the mask of royal displeasure slammed back into place. But she had seen it, that brief moment of humanity beneath the crown. "You ruined my ceremonial robes," he said, his voice lower now, more personal somehow. "Robes that belonged to my father and his father before him. Robes that have witnessed the signing of treaties and the forging of alliances that keep this kingdom strong." Each word was a nail in her coffin, but she couldn't look away from his eyes. There was something hypnotic about them, something that made her feel as if she were falling into molten gold. "What would you have me do with you, little Omega?" The formal address sent a shiver through her. In a room full of powerful alphas and betas, being called out as an Omega was like being stripped naked. It reminded everyone present, including herself, of exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of their world. "I don't know, Your Majesty," she answered honestly. "I know that I've wronged you, and that you have every right to punish me as you see fit. I only ask," she swallowed hard, gathering what little courage she had left. "I ask that you remember I meant no disrespect. I would die before I would willingly harm you or your house." Something in her voice, the genuine remorse, the absolute sincerity, the acceptance of her fate, seemed to affect him. She saw his jaw clench, saw him struggle with some internal battle that played out in the depths of his golden eyes. For a moment she thought he might show mercy, thought that perhaps the human in him might overcome the king. Then someone in the crowd laughed. It was quiet, quickly stifled, but in the absolute silence of the throne room, it rang out like a bell. The sound of someone finding amusement in watching the mighty Alpha King brought low by a clumsy Omega servant. The change in Kalen was immediate and terrifying. The struggle in his expression vanished, replaced by something arctic and final. His eyes blazed with golden light as his wolf surged forward, and she felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "You want to know what I do with servants who displease me?" His voice carried a resonance now that spoke of barely contained wildness. "I'll show you." Before she could blink, he moved. Not the measured approach of a king dispensing justice, but the lightning-quick strike of an apex predator. His hand closed around her throat, not crushing, but firm enough to tilt her head back and expose the vulnerable curve of her neck. The crowd gasped. Several people stepped back in shock. She heard someone, his advisor perhaps, call out in protest. "Your Majesty, surely." Silence. The command rang through the hall with enough force to rattle the crystal still hanging from the chandeliers. Ravenna felt the sharp press of elongated canines against her pulse point and realized with dawning horror what he intended. A claiming bite. Here, in front of the entire court, in front of visiting alphas who would carry word of this unprecedented act to every corner of the known world. "No," she breathed, not in protest. She had no right to protest, but in pure disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Kings didn't claim servant Omegas. They chose their mates from among the highest-ranking families, political alliances made flesh and sanctified by the most sacred bonds their kind could forge. "Yes," he growled against her skin, and she felt his wolf's satisfaction bleeding through the fury. This was what happened to those who humiliated the crown. This was justice, swift and irrevocable. The bite, when it came, was lightning and fire and agony all rolled into one overwhelming sensation. His fangs pierced deep, and she felt something fundamental shift inside her, a bond snapping into place like a chain around her very soul. The pain was incredible, but beneath it was something else, something warm and terrible and completely unwanted. The mate bond, the unbreakable connection between an alpha and his claimed Omega. She cried out, her knees buckling, but his arm around her waist kept her upright against his solid warmth. Through the haze of pain and shock, she could hear the court erupting in chaos. Voices raised in outrage, confusion, fascination. This was unprecedented, scandalous, the kind of event that would be talked about for generations. The marking seemed to last forever and no time at all. When he finally pulled back, blood stained his lips, and Ravenna felt something warm and alien flowering in her chest like a dark rose taking root. She looked up at him through tears of pain and shock, and saw her own horror reflected in his face, as if he hadn't meant to do it, as if his wolf had acted without his permission, driven by some instinct even he didn't understand. "What have I done?" he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear it over the chaos surrounding them. The question hung in the air between them like a curse. What had he done indeed? He had bound himself to a servant, a nobody, an Omega without family or fortune or political value. He had let his anger and his wolf override centuries of royal protocol in a moment of pure, unthinking rage. And now they would both pay the price. Ravana felt the world tilting sideways, as shock and pain overwhelmed her system. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was King Kaelin's face, those golden eyes wide with something that might have been regret, or horror, or perhaps the dawning realization of just how completely he had changed both of their lives with a single, irreversible act. When she woke, everything would be different. She would no longer be Ravana, the invisible kitchen servant. She would be the Alpha King's marked Omega, bound to him by bonds that could only be broken by death itself, whether either of them wanted it or not. The first thing Ravana became aware of was the softness beneath her, silk sheets that felt like liquid moonlight against her skin, so different from the rough wool blankets of her servants' quarters that for a moment she wondered if she had died and somehow found herself in whatever afterlife awaited Omegas who displeased their kings. Then the pain hit her. A burning, throbbing ache that radiated from the left side of her neck, spreading through her entire body like molten metal in her veins. She gasped, her hand flying to the source, and felt the raised, tender flesh of a fresh, claiming bite. The skin was swollen and hot, and when her fingers brushed over it, a jolt of sensation shot straight through her. Not just pain, but something else. Something that felt like an echo of emotion that wasn't entirely her own. The events in the throne room crashed back into her consciousness with brutal clarity. The wine, the fury in King Kaelin's golden eyes, the impossible moment when he had marked her in front of the entire court. She bolted upright, ignoring the way the movement sent waves of dizziness through her, and took in her surroundings with growing alarm. This was not the dungeons. This was not even the servants' quarters. The room she found herself in was larger than the entire kitchen staff dormitory, with soaring ceilings, tapestries that depicted ancient hunting scenes, and furniture that spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension. Heavy velvet curtains in deep burgundy were drawn across tall windows, but enough light filtered through to tell her it was well past sunset. How long had she been unconscious? Hours? Days? A soft knock at the door made her jump, and before she could respond, a woman entered carrying a silver tray. She was perhaps 40 years of age, dressed in the fine wool and linen that marked her as upper household staff, not a servant like Ravana, but not nobility either. Her graying brown hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and her bearing spoke of years spent managing the delicate politics of castle life. "You're awake," the woman said, her voice carefully neutral. "I'm Mrs. Helena, the king's personal household coordinator. I've brought you some broth and bread. You need to eat." "Where am I?" Ravana's voice came out as a croak, her throat dry and painful. "The Queen's quarters," Mrs. Helena replied matter-of-factly, setting the tray on a delicate table beside the bed. "Though they've been vacant since the late Queen's passing 15 years ago. His Majesty ordered them prepared for you." The Queen's quarters. Ravenna stared at the woman in shock, unable to process the implications. The Queen's quarters were sacred space, preserved exactly as they had been when King Kaelin's mother had died of fever during a particularly harsh winter. No one was permitted to enter them, except for the minimal cleaning required to prevent decay. "There must be some mistake," Ravana whispered. "I'm just a kitchen servant. I don't belong." "You belong wherever His Majesty says you belong, Mrs." Helena interrupted, her tone sharpening slightly. "And he has said you belong here, as the Royal Omega." The words hit Ravana like a physical blow. Royal Omega, the formal title for a king's claimed mate, a position that had been vacant since Kaelin's mother's death. It was a role she had never imagined, never dreamed of, never wanted. "This is impossible," she said, shaking her head. "He can't possibly mean for me to. I'm nobody. I have no family, no dowry, no political connections. I can't be." "You are what the claiming bite makes you," Mrs. Helena said firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less. The bond has been formed, witnessed by the court, and registered with the royal scribes. In the eyes of law and custom, you are now the king's mate." The matter-of-fact way she said it made the situation feel even more surreal. Ravenna reached up to touch the bite mark again, wincing at the tenderness. and felt that strange echo of emotion that wasn't quite her own. Was that the bond Mrs. Helena spoke of? This alien presence at the edge of her consciousness? "Where is the king?" she asked. Mrs. Helena's expression grew carefully blank. "His Majesty is indisposed. He has not been available for consultation since yesterday evening. So she had been unconscious for nearly 24 hours. And the king, her mate, though the thought still felt impossible, was avoiding her. Somehow that hurt worse than the physical pain of the bite. He regrets it," Ravenna said quietly. It wasn't a question. "That is not for me to say," Mrs. Helena replied, but her silence spoke volumes. "What I can tell you is that the castle is in chaos. Word of the claiming has already spread to every corner of the kingdom. There are nobles demanding explanations, advisors threatening to resign, and at least 3 neighboring kingdoms sending urgent diplomatic inquiries about the unprecedented nature of your elevation." Each word felt like another nail in a coffin that Ravenna was beginning to realize she would share with the king. Their impulsive bond hadn't just affected them, it had sent shockwaves through the carefully balanced political landscape of the realm. "I need to see him," Ravenna said, pushing back the silk covers and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to stand. "I need to talk to him about fixing this somehow." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Mrs. Helena said quickly, moving to steady Ravenna as she swayed. "His Majesty left specific instructions that you were to rest and recover. He also," she hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully, "he also instructed that you were not to be permitted to leave these quarters until he returns." The words hit Ravenna like a slap. "He's keeping me prisoner?" "He's keeping you safe," Mrs. Helena corrected. "The court is unsettled. There are those who view your sudden elevation with suspicion and resentment. The king believes it's best if you remain here until the initial shock subsides." Safe. Ravenna almost laughed at the bitter irony. She had spent 3 years carefully building a life of invisibility and security in the castle kitchens, and now she found herself at the very center of a political firestorm that could destroy the kingdom. How was that safe? But as she looked around the opulent quarters, at the silk hangings and priceless artifacts, at the luxury that surrounded her like a gilded cage, she began to understand. She wasn't being protected from the court's disapproval. She was being hidden from it, tucked away like an embarrassing secret until the king could figure out how to manage the crisis he had created. "How long?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," Mrs. Helena admitted, "but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that it may be some time. The king has much to consider, like how to undo an irreversible claiming bond, like how to explain to his advisors and allies why he had thrown away centuries of careful diplomatic marriage negotiations for a moment of rage, like how to contain the damage to his reputation and his kingdom's stability." Ravenna sank back onto the bed, suddenly exhausted despite having slept for nearly a day. The weight of her new reality was crushing. She was bound to a man who regretted claiming her, trapped in a role she never wanted, surrounded by people who would see her as either a threat or an opportunity to exploit. "Mrs. Helena," she said quietly, "what do you know about breaking mate bonds?" The older woman's expression grew troubled. "My lady, such things they're not spoken of lightly. The bond between Alpha and Omega, once sealed by the claiming bite, is considered sacred, permanent, but not impossible to break." Mrs. Helena was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed. "There are rumors, old stories, but the cost," she shook her head. "The cost is always terrible, usually death for one or both parties, and even then, there's no guarantee of success. Death." Ravenna absorbed this information with a strange sense of calm. So there was no easy escape from this situation, no simple solution that would allow both her and the king to return to their former lives. They were bound together now, whether they liked it or not. "Tell me about the king," Ravenna said suddenly. "I've worked in this castle for 3 years, but I know nothing about him beyond his reputation." Mrs. Helena seemed surprised by the change in subject, but she settled into the chair beside the bed with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. If I'm to be his mate, shouldn't I understand who he is?" "Very well," Mrs. Helena said slowly. "But I warn you, His Majesty's story is not a pleasant one." She was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts, then began. King Calin took the throne at 19, after his parents died in the plague that swept through the Eastern Territories. He was barely more than a boy, with older cousins and uncles who thought they could control him, use him as a figurehead while they wielded the real power. Ravenna found herself leaning forward, despite herself. She had heard pieces of this story over the years, but never from someone who had been present for the events. They were wrong, of course, Mrs. Helena continued. The first challenge came from his cousin Marcus, the king's own blood, who declared the crown should pass to him as the older, more experienced heir. Rather than allow the matter to be decided in council, Calin challenged him to ritual combat, and won, Ravenna said. Everyone knew that part of the story. Yes, but at a cost. Marcus was permanently damaged by the encounter. He lives still, but as a warning to others who might question the king's authority. His Majesty was 20 years old, and already the court feared him. The brutality of it made Ravenna's stomach turn, but she forced herself to listen. This was the man who had claimed her, whose emotions she could now sense flickering at the edge of her consciousness. She needed to understand him if she had any hope of navigating their bond. The rebellions came next, Mrs. Helena said. 3 separate attempts to overthrow him in his first 2 years as king, each one crushed with increasing violence. By the time he was 22, no one dared challenge his rule directly, but the court had grown, careful around him, fearful. And he never married, Ravenna observed. No, there were negotiations, of course, alliances to be considered, bloodlines to strengthen, but His Majesty seemed uninterested in such arrangements. Some said he was waiting for his fated mate to appear. Others believed he was simply too focused on consolidating power to be concerned with marriage. Mrs. Helena paused, her expression growing troubled. There was one woman who came close, Lady Catherine of the Northern Houses. The negotiations went on for months, and many believed an announcement was imminent. But then, something happened. She left court suddenly, and her family never spoke of the matter again. What kind of something? Ravenna asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. No one knows for certain, but Lady Catherine was changed when she left, afraid. She married a minor lord from her home territory within the month and has never returned to court. The implications of that story sent a chill through Ravenna. What had the king done to a woman of noble birth, someone with family and connections to protect her? What might he do to an Omega servant who had no one to speak for her? As if summoned by her dark thoughts, she felt a sudden spike of emotion that was definitely not her own. Anger, frustration, and underneath it all, something that felt almost like pain. The sensation was so strong it made her gasp, and Mrs. Helena looked at her with concern. "My lady, are you all right?" I think I felt something. From him." Ravenna pressed a hand to her chest, where the alien emotions seemed to be centered. "Is that normal?" Mrs. Helena's expression grew knowing. "Ah, the bond is settling. Yes, that's quite normal, especially in the first few days. You'll be able to sense his stronger emotions, and he'll sense yours. In time, if the bond deepens, you may even be able to share thoughts." The idea of the king being able to feel her emotions, possibly even read her thoughts, was terrifying. What if he sensed her fear, her resentment, her growing anger at being trapped in a situation neither of them wanted? Even as the thought crossed her mind, she felt another wave of alien emotion, this time a sort of cold emptiness that made her shiver. Was that what he was feeling right now? That hollow sensation? "Mrs. Helena," she said quietly. "Where did he go?" "When he left the castle. I believe he's gone to the old watchtower on the northern border. It's where he goes when he needs to think, or when his wolf needs to run free." His wolf. In all the shock and confusion of the last day, Ravenna had almost forgotten that the king, like all alphas, had another side to his nature. A wild, untamed part that was even more dangerous than the man. And if the bond was allowing her to feel his emotions, what would happen when his wolf was in control? As if responding to her thoughts, she felt another surge of alien feeling, this time sharper, more primal. Hunger, maybe, or need. It was followed immediately by what felt like iron control clamping down, as if the king was fighting his own nature. "He's struggling too," she realized aloud. "Of course he is," Mrs. Helena said gently. "Whatever his reasons for marking you, he's bound to you now just as you're bound to him. The bond affects both parties equally. But he's the king. He has advisors, resources, options I don't have. Perhaps. But he also has responsibilities you don't share. The weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders. And now a bond he never planned to form with someone he barely knows. Mrs. Helena leaned forward slightly. My lady, I know this situation is frightening and confusing, but you might consider that His Majesty is just as lost as you are right now. Lost. The word resonated with something deep in Ravenna's chest. Not her own feelings, but that echo of the king's emotions that seemed to be growing stronger by the hour. Yes, he felt lost, and angry, and underneath it all, something that felt almost like longing. But longing for what? His former life? Freedom from the bond? Or something else entirely? I need to see him, Ravenna said again, more firmly this time. We can't solve this by avoiding each other. My lady, I truly cannot permit. Then don't permit it, Ravenna interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. Just don't prevent it either. Look the other way when I leave these quarters tomorrow morning. Mrs. Helena stared at her for a long moment, and Ravenna saw something like approval in the older woman's eyes. You're not what I expected, she said finally. What did you expect? Someone who would be content to hide away and let others manage her life. But I see now why His Majesty's wolf chose you, even if his human mind doesn't understand it yet. Chose her. The phrase sent a shiver through Ravenna that was part fear, part something else she didn't want to examine too closely. The king's wolf had recognized something in her that even she didn't see. But what? Mrs. Helena, before you go, can you tell me anything about the Northern Watchtower? How to get there? The older woman sighed, clearly recognizing defeat when she saw it. Follow the main road north from the castle for about 3 miles. Then take the hunting trail that branches off to the east. The tower is another mile through the forest. But my lady, I must warn you, if His Majesty is letting his wolf run free, it may not be safe for you to approach alone. I'll be careful, Ravenna promised, though she had no idea what careful meant in a situation like this. After Mrs. Helena left with strict instructions about eating the broth and resting, Ravenna found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the disastrous wine incident. She moved to the tall windows and drew back the heavy curtains, revealing a view of the castle grounds that she had never seen from this angle. From the Queen's quarters, she could see the formal gardens where courtiers walked during pleasant weather, the training yards where the king's guards practiced their deadly arts, and beyond it all, the dark line of forest that stretched to the northern borders. Somewhere out there, the man who had claimed her was struggling with his own confusion and regret. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and tried to sort through the tangle of emotions, both hers and his, that filled her chest. Fear, yes, but also a growing determination. She refused to be a passive victim in this situation, trapped in elegant quarters like a bird in a gilded cage until someone else decided her fate. Tomorrow, she would find the king. She would make him face what he had done, what they were to each other now. And maybe, if they were very lucky, they could find a way to make the best of the impossible situation his moment of rage had created. As the last light faded from the sky, Ravenna felt another surge of emotion from the bond. Loneliness so profound it made her chest ache. The king might be avoiding her, but he couldn't escape the connection between them any more than she could. They were bound now, for better or worse, and it was time they both accepted what that meant. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the forest canopy, when Ravenna finally caught sight of the watchtower. The ancient stone structure rose from a rocky outcropping, like a finger pointing accusingly at the sky, its weathered walls speaking of centuries spent guarding the kingdom's northern borders against threats both human and wild. She had been walking for over an hour, following the hunting trail Mrs. Helena had described through increasingly dense woodland. Her legs ached. Her simple servant's dress was torn in 3 places from catching on thorns, and her soft indoor shoes were completely inadequate for the rough terrain. But the pull she felt through the mate bond, a constant tugging sensation that seemed to originate somewhere behind her breastbone, had only grown stronger the closer she came to her destination. He was here. She could feel his presence like a low thrumming in her bones, could sense the restless energy that seemed to surround him even at a distance. But there was something else in the bond now, something that made her wolf press nervously against her consciousness. Wildness. Raw, untamed, barely controlled wildness that spoke of a man on the very edge of his humanity. Ravenna paused at the edge of the clearing that surrounded the tower, suddenly uncertain. Mrs. Helena had warned her that the king might be letting his wolf run free, but she hadn't fully understood what that meant until now. Through the bond, She could feel the constant struggle between human rationality and primal instinct. And right now, instinct seemed to be winning. What would she find when she reached the tower? The controlled, calculating monarch who had ruled through fear and careful politics? Or something far more dangerous, the apex predator that lurked beneath the crown? Before she could lose her nerve entirely, she stepped into the clearing and began the climb up the rocky path to the tower's entrance. The ancient stones were slick with morning dew, and more than once she had to catch herself against the wall to keep from slipping. By the time she reached the heavy wooden door, her heart was pounding from both exertion and growing apprehension. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What exactly did one say to a king who had marked them in a fit of rage and then fled to the wilderness to avoid facing the consequences? "I know you're out there." The voice came from above, and she looked up to see King Kaelin standing on the tower's upper battlements, silhouetted against the pale morning sky. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the careful way he held himself, as if fighting some internal battle. "Your Majesty," she called up, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. "I need to speak with you." "Go back to the castle, Ravana." His voice was rougher than she remembered, with an edge that spoke of a man pushed to his limits. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should you," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. Hiding won't change what happened. A sound came from above that might have been laughter or a growl. With the acoustic properties of the old stone tower, it was impossible to tell which. "Hiding? Is that what you think I'm doing?" "What else would you call it?" She moved closer to the tower's base, craning her neck to keep him in sight. "You marked me in front of your entire court, then disappeared for 2 days. If that isn't hiding, then what is it?" For a long moment, he didn't respond. She could feel his emotions through the bond: anger, frustration, and underneath it all, a kind of desperate confusion that resonated with her own feelings. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, more controlled. "Come up, then. If you're determined to have this conversation, we might as well have it properly." The interior of the tower was spartanly furnished. A simple bed, a table and chairs, shelves lined with books on military strategy and kingdom administration. It was clearly a place the king retreated to when he needed to think, away from the constant demands and pressures of court life. But what struck Ravana most was the smell. Pine and steel and something wild, yes, but also something else. Something that made her newly awakened Omega instincts respond with a complicated mixture of attraction and wariness. She climbed the narrow stone stairs to the upper level, where she found King Kaelin standing with his back to her, looking out through one of the tall windows that offered a commanding view of the northern forests. He was dressed simply, leather pants, and a loose linen shirt that did nothing to hide the powerful lines of his frame. His dark hair was disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through it, and when he turned to face her, she saw that his golden eyes held a feral gleam that made her take an involuntary step backward. "You walked here alone," he said without preamble. "Through 3 miles of wilderness where there are wolves, bears, and worse things that hunt in the early morning hours." "I'm not helpless," Ravana replied, though her voice came out smaller than she had intended. Up close, the wildness she had sensed through the bond was almost overwhelming. This wasn't the controlled monarch who had dispensed cold justice from his throne. This was something far more primitive and dangerous. "No," he agreed, studying her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. "You're not. Most Omegas would never have dared approach an alpha in this state, especially not one they barely know." He moved closer, and she caught his scent more strongly, that wild musk that spoke of a man who had spent the last 2 days more wolf than human. "But then, you're not most Omegas, are you?" The question seemed to carry more weight than it should, as if he was seeing something in her that she didn't understand herself. "I'm nothing special," she said quietly. "Just a servant who was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Wrong place." He repeated the words thoughtfully, still moving closer with that predatory grace that was purely wolf. "Wrong time. You think what happened was a coincidence? An accident of fate? Wasn't it?" She found herself backed against the stone wall, but instead of feeling trapped, she felt strangely exhilarated. Through the bond, she could sense his struggle for control, could feel the way his wolf was responding to her presence. "You were angry about the wine, and you reacted without thinking. Now we're both paying the price." "The wine." His laugh was bitter, with an edge that made her shiver. "You still think this is about the wine, isn't it?" He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes, could count the faint scars that marked his hands and forearms, evidence of battles fought both as man and wolf. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been able to scent you for 3 years, Ravana. 3 years of catching your smell in the corridors and having to fight the urge to track you down. 3 years of knowing you were somewhere in my castle, but being unable to find you because you had perfected the art of becoming invisible." The confession hit her like a physical blow. "That's impossible. You never even looked at me." "I looked." His hand came up to rest against the wall beside her head, effectively caging her in. "I watched you serve at formal dinners, always keeping to the edges of the room, always ensuring you were beneath notice. I watched you in the garden sometimes, when you thought no one could see you feeding the kitchen scraps to the stray cats. I watched, and I told myself it was nothing, that whatever I was feeling was just the result of too much time without taking a proper mate." Each word was a revelation that shattered everything she thought she knew about her time at the castle. "Why didn't you ever say anything? What was I supposed to say?" His free hand came up to trace the air just above her cheek, not quite touching but close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin. "I'm the king. You're a servant. There are protocols, expectations, centuries of tradition governing such things. I couldn't just claim you because my wolf found your scent appealing, but you could mark me in a rage over some spilled wine." "No," he said, and for the first time since she had arrived, his expression softened slightly. "I couldn't. That's why I'm here, in the middle of nowhere, trying to understand what my wolf was thinking when it overrode 3 years of careful control." The admission of weakness, of uncertainty, was so unexpected that Ravana felt her defensive anger begin to crumble. This wasn't the cold, calculating monarch she had feared. This was a man who was just as lost and confused as she was, struggling to understand what had happened between them. "So what do we do now?" she asked quietly. "I don't know." He dropped his hand from the wall and stepped back, giving her space to breathe again. "I've spent 2 days trying to figure that out. The advisors are demanding explanations I can't give. Half the noble families are questioning my fitness to rule. 3 neighboring kingdoms have sent diplomatic inquiries about the unprecedented nature of my choice in mates. The weight of the political implications was staggering. Ravenna had been so focused on her own transformation from servant to royal Omega that she hadn't fully considered how their bond would affect the larger kingdom. "They want you to repudiate the claiming," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some do. Others are suggesting we find a way to minimize the damage. Perhaps keep you at court, but seek a proper political marriage as well." His jaw clenched. "As if I could mark another while bound to you. As if the bond works that way." The casual possessiveness in his voice sent an unexpected thrill through her, even as the rational part of her mind recoiled from it. She was no one's possession, regardless of what some ancient claiming ritual might suggest. But her Omega instincts responded to the Alpha's protective tone with a warmth she didn't want to examine too closely. "And what do you want?" she asked. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't identify. "I want to turn back time. I want to undo that moment of madness and go back to the way things were before I complicated both our lives with an irreversible mistake." He met her eyes, and she saw genuine regret in their golden depths. "But I also want to stop fighting the urge to touch you, to claim you properly, not in anger but in something else. And those wants are mutually exclusive." The honesty of the admission stole her breath. Through the bond, she could feel the truth of what he was saying, the genuine conflict between his rational mind and the deeper instincts that had driven him to mark her. "You regret claiming me," she said. "I regret the circumstances. I regret the chaos it's caused, the position it's put you in, the impossible choice I've given my kingdom between accepting a servant as their queen or questioning their king's judgment." His hand came up to run through his disheveled hair. "But the claiming itself, no, my wolf has no regrets about that. And you, not your wolf, you." He studied her for a long moment, and she felt a complex wash of emotions through the bond. Desire, uncertainty, frustration, and something that might have been hope. "Ask me again in a month," he said finally, "when the initial madness of the bond has settled, and we can think clearly about what we are to each other." A month. She tested the idea, trying to imagine a month of living as the king's mate while they both tried to figure out whether they could stand each other. What happens during that month? You learn to be a queen. I learn to be a mated alpha. We both learn whether this bond is something we can live with or something that will destroy us both. The casual mention of being a queen made her stomach lurch. I can't be a queen. I don't know the first thing about politics or diplomacy or running a kingdom. I'm a kitchen servant. You were a kitchen servant, he corrected. Now you're my mate. And my mate, regardless of her origins, will need to understand how to navigate court life if she's going to survive it. The matter-of-fact way he said it made the situation feel both more real and more impossible. Survive it? Ravana. His voice carried a warning that made her pay close attention. You've gone from the lowest position in the castle hierarchy to the second highest in a single day. There will be people who resent that elevation, who see you as a threat to their own positions or aspirations. There will be others who try to use you to get closer to me or to manipulate kingdom policy through you. He stepped closer again, and this time there was nothing predatory in the movement, just a king trying to protect what was his. Court politics are vicious under the best of circumstances. For someone in your position, they could be lethal. The warning sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. She had been so focused on the impossibility of her new role that she hadn't considered the dangers that came with it. Then teach me, she heard herself say. If I need to learn to survive as your mate, then teach me how. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. You're not going to argue that this is all a mistake? Demand that I find a way to break the bond? Would it work if I did? No. Then what's the point? She straightened, calling on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. I may not have asked for this, but neither did you. We're bound together now, and running away from each other isn't going to change that. So we might as well figure out how to make the best of it. For the first time since she had known him, King Kalen smiled, not the cold, calculating expression he wore in court, but something genuine and warm that transformed his entire face. Mrs. Helena was right, he said. You're not what anyone would have expected. Mrs. Helena said that? Among other things. She also said you were determined to find me, despite her best efforts to keep you safely tucked away in the Queen's quarters. His smile took on a slightly wicked edge. She may have mentioned something about your tendency to be stubborn. I prefer determined, Ravana said primly, and was rewarded with what sounded like genuine laughter. Determined it is. He moved to the table and pulled out a chair for her, a courtly gesture that felt strange coming from a man who had been more wolf than human for the past 2 days. Sit. If we're going to do this properly, there are things you need to know. About the court, about the kingdom's politics, about what you can expect in the coming weeks. She settled into the offered chair, hyper-aware of his proximity as he took the seat across from her. Through the bond, she could sense that his emotional state was stabilizing, the wild edge settling into something more manageable. Being near her seemed to calm his wolf, just as being near him was quieting her own anxieties. First, he said, you need to understand that you have enemies now. People who will smile to your face and plot your destruction behind closed doors. Lady Margaret Ashworth, for instance. She had her sights set on becoming my queen, and she won't take kindly to being displaced by a servant. Lady Margaret. Ravenna tried to place the name among the nobles she had served during formal dinners. Blonde? Always wears blue? That's her. Beautiful, well-connected, and absolutely ruthless when her ambitions are threatened. She'll likely try to befriend you at first, offer to help you navigate court life. Don't trust anything she says. The warning settled into Ravena's mind, like a piece of armor. She had always been good at reading people. It was a survival skill for servants. But court politics would require a whole different level of awareness. Who else? Lord Roderick Thorne, my former chief advisor. He resigned yesterday in protest over the irregularity of our bonding. He'll likely work to undermine your position from outside the court. Duke William Hayes. He has 3 unmarried daughters and was hoping to form an alliance through marriage. Chancellor Robert Mills. He believes strongly in traditional bloodlines and will see your elevation as a dangerous precedent. The list seemed endless, and with each name, Ravana felt the weight of her new position more acutely. These weren't just people who disliked her. They were powerful individuals who could make her life miserable or even dangerous. It's not all bad news, Kalen continued, apparently sensing her growing dismay through the bond. You'll have allies too. Mrs. Helena, obviously. She's already declared her support for you, and her opinion carries weight among the household staff. General Marcus Stone believes in judging people by their actions rather than their birth, and he respects courage above all else. Lady Catherine Whitmore has always been an advocate for recognizing merit regardless of social position. Lady Catherine, Ravenna repeated. Isn't she the one who came close to marrying me before? His expression grew carefully neutral. Yes. You'll meet her soon. She's returning to court for the Harvest Festival next week. I imagine that will be interesting. The casual way he mentioned his former almost betrothed coming to court made Ravenna's stomach clench with an emotion she refused to recognize as jealousy. Will she cause problems? I don't think so. Catherine is pragmatic. She understands the realities of political life, and she's moved on since our negotiations ended. He paused, studying Ravenna's expression with those keen golden eyes. But you'll need to be prepared for questions about why I chose you over her, about what you have that she lacks. What do I have that she lacks? The question came out before she could stop it. You're my mate, he said simply. Whatever my wolf recognized in you, whatever drew me to mark you despite every rational reason not to, that's something that can't be negotiated or arranged through diplomatic channels. Catherine was a political choice. You, he shrugged, as if the words weren't coming easily. You're something else entirely. The explanation should have been reassuring, but it raised as many questions as it answered. What had his wolf seen in her? What quality did she possess that had been strong enough to override years of careful control? There's something else you need to understand, Kaelin said, his tone growing more serious. The bond between us. It's going to continue deepening over the coming weeks. You'll feel my emotions more strongly, and I'll feel yours. There may be times when the connection becomes overwhelming. What does that mean? It means we'll need to spend time together, regular contact to keep the bond stable. It means you'll need to learn to shield your thoughts and feelings when necessary, or risk broadcasting them to half the court through me. He leaned forward slightly, his golden eyes holding hers. And it means we'll need to discuss the physical aspects of our bond at some point. Heat flooded her cheeks. In all the chaos and confusion, she had managed to avoid thinking too deeply about the fact that she was now mated to arguably the most powerful alpha in the known world, that their bond would eventually require intimacy. Not today, he said quickly, apparently sensing her discomfort through their connection. But soon. The bond will demand completion, and it's better that we discuss it openly rather than let it catch us both off guard. The practical way he discussed something so intimate was both reassuring and terrifying. This was a man who had learned to compartmentalize every aspect of his life, to approach even personal matters with the strategic thinking of a king. But what did that mean for her? For them? I should get back to the castle, she said, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by everything he had told her. Mrs. Helena will be worried, and there's probably preparation I need to do. Yes, he agreed, rising from his chair. But not alone. I'll escort you back. Is that wise? If you're seen returning with me, won't it raise questions about where you've been? Let them ask questions. His voice carried that edge of authority that reminded her exactly who she was talking to. I'm done hiding from the consequences of my actions. It's time I started behaving like a mated alpha, instead of a man running from his responsibilities. The change in his demeanor was striking. In the space of their conversation, he had transformed from the wild, uncertain man she had found at the tower to something closer to the controlled monarch she knew from court. But there was something different now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. What changed? She asked. An hour ago, you were ready to spend another week in the wilderness avoiding the situation. Now you're talking about returning to court and facing the consequences. He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. You did, he said finally. You walked 3 miles through dangerous territory to find me. You didn't cower or demand I fix everything for you. You accepted the situation and asked me to teach you how to deal with it. He stepped closer, and she caught that wild scent again, but fainter now, more controlled. My wolf chose well, even if my human mind didn't understand why at the time. The compliment sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with their bond, and everything to do with the genuine respect she heard in his voice. For 3 years, she had been invisible, overlooked, dismissed as unimportant. To have the king, her mate, acknowledge her strength was a gift she hadn't expected. Come, he said, moving toward the stairs. Let's go home. We have a kingdom to manage, and a court to convince that their new queen is worthy of their respect. Queen. The word still felt impossible. But as she followed King Kaelin down the tower stairs and out into the brightening morning, Ravana began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be worthy of the title. The walk back to the castle was easier than the journey out had been, partly because she now had proper boots that Kaelin had somehow produced from the tower's supplies, and partly because she was no longer walking toward an uncertain confrontation. They talked as they walked, about court protocols, about the upcoming harvest festival, about the delicate balance of power that kept the kingdom stable. But underneath the practical conversation, Ravana was aware of the bond between them settling into something steadier, less chaotic than it had been. His presence beside her felt right in a way that had nothing to do with political necessity, and everything to do with something deeper, more primitive. Whatever had driven his wolf to claim her, she was beginning to understand that it went beyond simple attraction or territorial instinct. There was something between them, a compatibility that existed on levels she was only beginning to explore. And as the familiar towers of the castle came into view, Ravana made a decision. She wouldn't just learn to survive as King Kaelin's mate. She would learn to thrive. She would prove to the court, to the kingdom, and to herself that a kitchen servant could become a queen worthy of respect. The man walking beside her had given her a chance to transform her life completely. The least she could do was make sure she was worthy of his faith in her, even if neither of them yet understood exactly what they had become to each other. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.